This is the second video lecture on the chapter on psychological disorders. The first lecture, we ended up talking about the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. What does DSM-4 stand for? This is the tool that is used to diagnose. It offers the statistics about how long a condition and the prevalence of a condition. 4 refers to, this is the 4th edition. We are currently in the 5th edition. And so this book gets rewritten, and every time it's rewritten, it has different diagnoses in it, and it changes. It's based on a group of people who all have this professional background, and they get together and they discuss what they think should be considered disorderly and what they think shouldn't be considered disorderly. And it just goes to show that these conditions that we think of as disordered are culturally specific and culturally and historically specific. Your textbook suggests that about half of adults at some point in their life will qualify for a diagnosis or have some of the symptoms. I would argue it's probably higher than that. I don't know anybody that wouldn't qualify for some of these symptoms. About 80% of us won't get treatment. About 80% of us won't seek any help, which I think is unfortunate. If you had a broken arm, you would certainly seek treatment. I'm a believer in it is a sign of strength if you get help. It is not a sign of weakness, because what it says is, I can't handle this, and I know enough about my mental health and about my well-being to know that I shouldn't be this way, or I don't want to feel this way, and I'm smart enough to know that I can't do it. I'm going to ask for help. And that is the camp that I run, that I operate in, and believe that this is getting help for mental illness is no different than getting help for a physical illness. Unfortunately, there's a stigma. Women are more likely to seek treatment, to seek help. I think that's probably because women just in general are given more social permission to talk about their feelings. And then the diagnoses are also different. Women are more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety, which is a kind of worry. And men are more likely to be diagnosed with substance abuse, which kind of all makes sense if you think about how men and women deal with their feelings. Okay, so now I want to talk about anxiety, which is a group of disorders, and what they all have in common is irrational worry. Worry that doesn't serve a purpose, right? This is the key, is that worry when there's no logical reason to be worried about that particular thing. Worry that serves a purpose is not illogical. So let me use an example. I remember telling my counselor that I would sit in the movie theater and I would worry that my house was on fire. And so I couldn't focus on the movie. I couldn't, and this is where it starts to interfere with your life, right? I wanted to be with my friends and family, and I wanted to be focused on the entertainment, but I couldn't because I was constantly worrying that my house was on fire. And what was I going to do when I got home and my house was on fire, right? Well, if I was living in California or Australia, right, during the wildfires, that wouldn't be so irrational. That would make total sense. But there was no reason to worry that my house was on fire. There was no, it would have been like spontaneous combustion kind of thing. So it wasn't reasonable, and it made it difficult for me to do the things that I wanted to do. Think about a condition that's sometimes called test anxiety, right? So that's a kind of worry. You may study for 8-10 hours and know the stuff backwards and forwards, but when you sit down to take the test, you can't focus on the questions because you have this anxiety that you won't get the answers right. That is a kind of irrational worry. If you have prepared, right, and you know the answers, why are you worried about it? And the worry that is not logical interferes with your ability to actually answer the question. That's when it becomes that's when it becomes an anxiety disorder. Because anxiety actually serves a purpose, right? When we were talking about stress, to have a little bit of worry is actually good, because a little bit of anxiety makes you more vigilant. It makes you focused. If you have a little bit of worry about your test, you might study for your test. If you have no worry about your test, you won't study. Therefore, you won't be prepared and you won't do quite so well. So a little bit of anxiety is actually functional. It's orderly, it's logical. When worry interferes with what you need to do, that's when we call it anxiety. So if you look on your slide here, the second box, you've got some of the physical symptoms, because anxiety is a kind of stress, right? It causes it's the same hormones that stress and fear. It causes cortisol. People often get nauseous because the body's fight or flight system kicks in. So anxiety wears us down. I know in my case, it makes me lightheaded. I often lose my appetite. I have an early anxiety warning system where my eye starts to twitch. I've had a handful of students who know that one, but you can't see it, but I can feel it. And so what it says to me, when my body, because often our body is more in tune to what's going on in the world, it says, oh, you're starting to get anxious about something, Sarah. What are you getting anxious about? So that goes back to that Susan David stuff that I've talked about earlier on about emotional agility. When we're experiencing emotion, lean into it and be curious. So my eye starts to twitch. Okay, well, that's a physical symptom that I'm anxious about something. What am I anxious about? Let's figure this out. Let's take it apart. Is it something that's logical to be worried about? Or is it not? I mean, at a time like this, it might be logical to worry about getting sick. If I've never ever left my house in the last 7 weeks, that might be a little irrational to worry about getting sick. Okay, so I hope that makes some sense. That's what we mean by anxiety. It is a kind of worry that is non-productive and is not logical, right? How often or how you experience that illogical and unproductive anxiety, that's what defines if it's generalized anxiety, if it's a panic attack, if it's an anxiety disorder. I suffer from just the generalized anxiety. It's just always there, under the surface. I can't really pinpoint it. I just know that it's just there. And there might be triggers, right? There might be triggers, maybe a bill, maybe I look at the calendar, oh my gosh, I only have 2 weeks to finish all these lectures, right? And that may cause my worry and my anxiety level to go up. But it's difficult to identify a specific cause. So it's a globally persistent. Panic attacks are an extreme kind of anxiety. And the difference, at least as I have read about them, between an anxiety attack and a panic attack is panic attacks often, they don't have as identifiable cause, and the physical symptoms are different. So I have a friend of mine who suffers from panic attacks, and she describes it as the feeling that she's going to die. So and it's an attack because it comes on quite quickly. And it's this overwhelming sensation that, oh my gosh, I'm having a heart attack. I'm going to die. Something bad's going to happen. And your body sort of kicks in the anxiety in your head causes the stress response in your body. And so many people actually end up in the emergency room thinking that they're having an anxiety, thinking that they're having a heart attack, and there's nothing wrong with their heart. It is just a panic attack. I have never had one, but my friend who talks about them, so it becomes a disorder. So the difference between a panic attack is maybe it's a one-time thing. Maybe it's a one-time thing. And here's another thing that's kind of worth pointing out is you may be 19 and have never had any of these conditions, but a lot of these disorders show up for the first time in your 20s. I recently heard from a student who said that, he'd never had any of these, and he was eating breakfast one day and his heart rate just started, and he had his first panic attack at about 23, and he was just eating breakfast. It just came all of a sudden. And then it took him months and months and months to sort of move past it. And that's kind of how these things happen. So I like to say, if you got to your 30s and you haven't had depression or a panic attack or a schizophrenic break, you're good to go. I would say my first bout of depression probably came when I was 14, but the next one came 19, 20. It was, anyway. Okay, so panic disorder is when you have panic attacks frequently. So my friend suffered from panic disorder, and she said she would come home from work and basically have to lay down in her kitchen for the next couple hours until she could calm herself, so she could calm her heart, till she could calm her body, because she had so many of these panic attacks. And so when it happens frequently, we consider that disorderly. Agoraphobia is an interesting one because it's people often think that this is agoraphobia. It's a phobia, and phobias are a kind of anxiety. They're an irrational worry. And this is an irrational worry specifically about having panic attacks in public. So agoraphobes, like I have agoraphobes running in my family. Agoraphobes are people that never leave their house. If you've seen the movie Better Call Saul, his brother is agoraphobic. He doesn't leave the house, and he's afraid. Or he's got a lot of fears, but the key for agoraphobia, is that you will have one of these attacks, one of these feeling like you're having a heart attack while you're in public. So agoraphobic people commonly stay home, and they have an irrational fear of being in public. Not the same thing as social anxiety. That is something different that we'll talk about later on. I'm going to stop here, and when I come back, I want to talk in the third one. We will talk about some of the explanations, some of the potential causes of phobias and anxiety, and then we'll talk about some of the phobias, and yeah, move on to some of the other kind of interesting stuff.